Hello and welcome to The World of Intelligence, an open source intelligence podcast brought to you by the Jane's Intelligence Unit. For more information on how we can help with OSINT training and development, go to janes.com/OSINT training. For this podcast episode, I'm here with Mark Wilson from the Jane's Intelligence Unit.
Hi Terry, hello everyone.
We're going to talk today about searching for information and some of the changes that we've seen over the last month or so. And as this is the last podcast episode of 2019, maybe we'll recap a little bit some of the bigger changes that we've seen over the course of the year and how that's affected some of our open source intelligence work more generally. Where I wanted to sort of start off really was talking about searching and the way that we've seen some shifts recently. There's been some interesting changes in the search engine world. Google has changed the way that it presents results to people, in the sense that what they're doing now is using, I guess, smarter ways of actually assuming what people are looking for based on their search terms.
Okay.
So in some ways, they've sort of watered down again the reliance on Boolean logic, which is something we always cover in our training courses. It's something we always teach people, different ways of combining together their search terms to help filter and narrow down what they're looking for. That is an interesting area because the way the search engines are going, they're trying to make them smarter and smarter all the time. So they're not relying on people actually putting in exactly what they are looking for. They're making more and more assumptions and smarter assumptions as well.
Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing for online researchers?
It's tough to say, I think, because for me personally as a researcher, I kind of want to be able to be very specific in what I'm putting in. But at the same time, I do appreciate that the improvements that tools like Google are making, it does make it a bit more of a shortcut. So it does sometimes present you with results which, you know, in that first couple of pages, you're getting a quick snapshot of what you need before you then go on to manipulating maybe your search terms a bit to drill down into the massive information that it presents you. So yeah, at the moment, I'm sort of thinking maybe it's a good thing, as long as people, especially professional researchers, are still conscious of what it's doing and what's going on in the background of the way that the search engines present results. Because I think often people aren't, especially, I guess, non-research professionals, people who are just using the search engine normally day to day. They're just sticking in one or two keywords, and whatever comes up on the first page, they rely on the search engine to give them what they're looking for. For that purpose, yeah, this is probably going to be a positive. But for us as researchers, we just need to be more conscious of what's going on. And,
I'd be asking the question, is the search engine giving me what it thinks I need?
Yes.
And that could be positive or negative.
That was always the case, I think, to an extent, especially with Google. Is it getting better though at working out what you want on its own without you having to put in too many inputs or more inputs? Yeah, I think it is. Certainly, based on what they've posted on there, if anyone's interested who's listening, you can go onto this Google blog, the search engine blog that they have, and they post latest updates and things like that, changes that they've made. And this was a change that we saw a little while ago that they posted information about. But yeah, it's one I'm slightly torn on because I do appreciate what they're trying to do, and I appreciate the improvements they're trying to make. Whether it does help us as researchers, I don't know. Whether it just makes people more lazy as well, that's the other impact that I'm more concerned about is, do we just get used to just actually researching more casually rather than actually thinking more carefully about what it is we're trying to get out of the search engine?
Thinking more strategically about how you go about searching for information on the internet. What do you think is the solution in terms of, is it to really cast your search over more search engines, or what's your thoughts on that?
One of the things we've always said to people is, look, the search engine you're using is only going to present you results from within its own index. So whatever it's gathered, whatever it's added to that index. In the case of something like Google, it has a huge index, so that's why people use it as a sort of search engine of first resort. Yeah. But there are a lot of other search engines out there. It's worth trying them, especially if you feel like you're not getting the results that you think might be out there from the search engine that you're using. And if you think you're falling more into a bit of a filter bubble. So we talk about the filter bubble concept where, the search tools, search engines, websites even send you back to information and sources of information that are familiar to you, that they know you're more likely to click on based on the data that they've got about you. So it could be from your previous search history. Yeah. It could be from your cookies in your browser. If you're using Google and you're logged in, it could be based on all the other information Google has about you. You know, what comes up in your Gmail, what you've looked at on YouTube, all of those things they can combine together, so potentially.
Could be saving you time from one perspective, but on another perspective, it's problematic, I guess.
It could save you time because it could just immediately, I mean, that's the idea anyway. I mean, certainly from the Google perspective, they want to have all of that information so they can quickly work out exactly what it is you're interested in, but also which are the sources that you think are the most trustworthy or reliable. And it presents you that selection in the first couple of pages of results, perhaps, so that you don't then have to dig through all the rest.
Yeah. Yeah.
However, you know, if you're searching on a topic where perhaps you're not always familiar with the sources or whatever, you know, you don't necessarily want to rely on the search engine because other people or people who run websites, online information sources, etc., they could be potentially trying to game the search engines and trying to get up the rankings and present themselves as reliable sources when they might not be. So you can't necessarily just rely on the judgment of the search engine to match up what it thinks you're interested in with what you might, or what it assumes you think are reliable sources, or otherwise you run the risk also of missing potentially useful information.
That's totally it, isn't it? Yeah. That's one of my concerns from that. I mean, if you're producing a piece of work and you always go to 5 same sources, that's good in one sense. You know your sources, but that question's always in the back of your mind. Yeah. Do you really know your sources? And I guess you always want to explore new sources for new information, right? Yeah, so I guess that's a problem where you have a search engine that is learning your sources in a way. Yep. It's giving you back what it thinks you want. But then as an online researcher, really you want the widest section of sources to get the best reporting that you can. So
totally, yeah, no, it's exactly right. And it you put me in mind of the sort of start of our OSINT training courses where we normally ask people, how do you make sure you're not missing anything? You know, how do you potentially also think about breaking out of that filter bubble? So we've always said to people, try out different search engines, see what you find on them, see what you get. It's been harder, I think, over the years to make an argument or a clear argument for saying to people, if you don't go to other search engines, you will have a high chance of missing something. I think in the past that was probably more the case, less so these days with a tool like Google because its index is so vast, and it does overlap a lot from what we've seen when we've done comparisons where we compared search results in Google, search results in Bing.
That's a really good method, yeah.
You don't tend to see a lot of difference for most topics, I find. Yeah. So it's really hard for me to then make the argument to people we're training to say, make sure you go to both, otherwise you're going to miss things. What we do try and do is perhaps direct people to more specialist resources where they might have a more specialist requirement, so that they can get information that might not be presented so highly within the search engine's results, because a search engine like Google is going to favor those more generic or general sources, news sources, for example. It might not go into the more specialist resources when you've got a particular topic you're interested in. So one of the things we always do is try and flag up where there might be, or get people, especially OSINT analysts, I think they've got to be aware of what specialist resources are out there for their particular field or their particular topic that they're interested in, which is difficult to do sometimes. But there's a lot of handy sort of dashboards that have been produced that are out there on particular topics, OSINT-related topics, that people have curated and put together, which can be good start points. You find a lot of those actually, funnily enough, on start.me.
Start.me.
Yeah, the dashboard website. Yeah. It's always a good place to look. And I think if people are looking for, one of the ways I try and find if anyone's put together a specialist dashboard is to, in Google, for instance, do a site search. So site:/start.me and then whatever my keywords are. See if there's any dashboards that come up, because there's always more and more being created. So it's potentially a way to find more stuff that may not be surfaced by a search engine straight away. And in the past, I think in the old days, we used to go to directories for that kind of thing. But you don't tend to find many directories around these days.
Yeah, just on that point as well. I mean, the way I go about finding things like start.me and the like is just by following OSINT specialists on Twitter. I mean, we had there's a whole bunch of great OSINT analysts out there. Some of which have been on this podcast. And just following those guys on Twitter is just brilliant to get insights. Their insights is one thing, but the other thing is the information they share, the dashboards they create.
Definitely.
And I think Twitter's a great place.
It's a great resource for that. Yeah, it's true. I mean, don't get me wrong, there is a lot of rubbish on Twitter. There's a lot of trolling. Seen plenty of that recently. But yeah, at the same time, it is a great resource, and you don't even have to be on Twitter to get access to that. Exactly. You can just go straight onto Twitter without logging in, search it, and you'll find, especially if people are looking. There's like you said, there's a good OSINT community.
There is,
and it's growing all the time. More and more people are contributing things to that.
The other thing about all this in terms of the topic of searching is another part of this browser hygiene.
Yeah, it's a good point. And we sort of touched on that on the last podcast episode with Rob Pritchard, cybersecurity expert, where we talked about minimizing your digital footprint and some of the steps you can take. A very basic, simple measure, browser hygiene, take out the cookies.
So is that something you recommend doing at the start of every research session, or?
Yeah, I think if people have got the time and the scope to do that, they should definitely think about setting that in as part of their workflow. So even at the end of each session, clearing out your history, clearing out your cookies, just resetting and going again for the next session. What that means is sometimes you want to use perhaps a separate browser for doing your research. In an ideal world, we'd use virtual machines or separate machines to do a lot of our research on, which I know is impractical in a lot of contexts. But yeah, I certainly would advise people, if you're doing searches and you find that the search engines keep sending you back to the same information sources, then maybe you're falling into a filter bubble. You need to break out of it. And certainly then you want to look at, okay, well, have I cleared out my cookies, or have I done my browser hygiene recently? And if not, right, let's get that done and then search again and see what happens and if that makes a difference or not.
I guess a big part of this is getting into the habit of reminding yourself to do that at the start of every research session.
And I think it's one of the things that
the habits of OSINT.
Yeah, the habits of OSINT. Yeah, there you go. That's a book title right there. Those are simple things that I think a lot of people overlook. Well, people sort of, you say it to them and everyone nods and says yes, we know we should do that, and then goes away, and I'm sure that people forget.
It's kind of it's connected, I guess, to the immediacy of the internet, isn't it? You kind of you get on there, you're on Google or whatever, the search box is waiting for you, and you're ready to go. So you're ready to do your research right there. So I guess that's kind of a little bit of a memory check. Is just like clear it before you start, and then you do your best to ensure you're getting the most balanced results.
Definitely. And I mean, one of the things that I mentioned on a training course we delivered in London last week was a resource that I think people found useful and interesting. Another search engine, and always remember there are plenty out there, but one that's I think grown in popularity and had more media coverage recently is Ecosia, which is a search engine where it's great for doing basic searches. I don't think it's necessarily going to have as comprehensive a selection of information as Google will do. So when you're doing your more detailed, in-depth research, perhaps you aren't going to find as much in there. But for your normal basic searches, when you just want to quickly look something up that you're going to find, you just have to use a search engine to find it. It's great for that. And I think kind of disaggregating some of your searches really helps.
Right.
So going to other search engines for doing basic stuff, and then maybe going to Google for the more specialist stuff might be a good approach to help you break out of the filter bubble. And the nice thing about Ecosia is that from the revenue they make from searches, they plant trees. And so they're helping mitigate the impact of climate change, which, anything...
Ethical search engine.
Yeah, it's a very ethical search engine. Yeah. And I think we're all becoming conscious of the kind of carbon footprints we have. And, all our online activity now is leaving more of a carbon footprint. So, all the search engines have got their big sort of data warehouses and servers that are churning out a lot of energy, or using a lot of energy, and so churning out a lot of carbon as a result. And so, I think it's something we have to be conscious of, that if you can offset some of that, you may as well. And I think it's quite topical at the moment because we've got obviously the big climate change conference going on in Madrid this week, and it's something that we've had a lot more requirements on, with a lot more questions coming to us this year about climate change as a national security topic, as a more and more important threat that people have to think about. It's a more immediate threat, I think. In the last sort of 5 or 10 years, it's gone from being something that people thought they could worry about later to now being something that we really have to think about now. So we did a recent intelligence briefing on the topic of climate change and the impacts for the military. And that's something that militaries, defence, security organisations, governments need to start planning for now if they're going to adapt to the way that climate change is going to shape the world in 20 to 30 years' time.
Just from an OSINT perspective, I mean, if you are beginning research on a topic that, for example, is not maybe on the surface is not necessarily or doesn't seem to be too connected to security and defence issues like climate change, for example, but as you just said, clearly is. If you're beginning your research on new topics like that, I mean, like yourself, take us through your process in terms of, how you begin to, gather information on a topic such as climate change and security and how you plan for that.
Great question. I'm not going to pretend that I've got a huge depth of expertise on climate change. That's not something I've focused on a huge amount over the years. But as I said, because of the nature of the requests we've been getting in over the last 12 to 18 months, it's been an area that we've had to focus on a lot more. So I've started to obviously read more. And I think generally we're all becoming more and more aware of it. It's making the news a lot more. Yeah. So we are being presented, I think, day to day with more information on climate change and what's happening. But that aside, you've still got to do a lot more digging in order to be able to produce something worthwhile in order to answer a client's questions usually. So for me, and this is sort of something I would do across any projects that I begin where I'm approaching, because I approach most specialist projects as a generalist, and so I don't necessarily always have a huge depth of expertise on those projects. Which I think is common for most people working in open source intelligence. And so where I start is, and this is something we always advise on our training, look first, what have you done? What have you as an organisation or a team done on the topic previously?
Do you need to understand and plan for tomorrow's threats without diverting valuable resources from the threats you face today? At Janes, we deliver cutting-edge, trusted open source intelligence on current, emerging and future threats and assessments of the capabilities you need to mitigate them. Janes is the only single resource for comprehensive, structured and connected intelligence on military equipment, inventories and orders of battle, which means we can help you reveal previously hidden connections. We also provide data and insight on conventional and asymmetric threats, including terrorism, extremism and organized crime. So, if you are tired of collecting and processing overwhelming volumes of inconsistent and unstructured data, let us reduce your workload. Janes assess, validates, and verifies huge volumes of data and then adds insight you need to focus your resources. We can also help improve your open source intelligence capability through intelligence reporting, RFI services, and open source intelligence tradecraft training. If that sounds good, visit janes.com/intelligence unit to find out more.
So, I did this intelligence briefing that's on Jane's website on climate change just recently, but actually we did one on more or less the same topic about 8 years ago. No, actually, that's going back too far. I think it was in 2013, perhaps. Okay. And so, that was something that I could use as a bit of a reference point. Yeah. Listen to that and see, okay, well, what was the gist of the topic then? But also, as well as looking internally, what have we got already? And I did then what I do on a lot of similar topics is I asked around. I asked the rest of the team, the rest of our experts within Janes. Yeah. What are you guys seeing in terms of what militaries are doing around the world to help them adapt to climate change? And then we're also fortunate in that we've got on hand experts from our adjacent IHS market colleagues or experts that we're close to who work in the climate and what is now the climate and carbon team, who are tracking and monitoring and measuring climate change and to explain it to customers within the energy sector and beyond the energy sector. And they were fantastic in terms of helping me get on top of the intricacies of that topic. And presenting me with some of their research. So just tapping into those expertise was a massive boost in trying to get me on top of what I needed to know to help research that topic.
I think that's a really interesting point, because if you talk about open source information, I think a lot of people, and me included as well, in that when I first started out in this area, you automatically think of information that's on the internet, right?
Yeah, everything's online. Yeah,
everything's online. Yeah. But actually, another avenue of that is your contacts, the people you know, right?
Definitely.
And your colleagues at work.
It doesn't always have to be people you know. Sometimes it can be people you don't know.
Exactly.
And just identifying experts who you can reach out to and contact, and you'll often find people who are very approachable. And, it's nice, I think, for us also. One of the benefits, I have to say, of coming from Jane's is that generally people are very responsive to us. Hopefully that'll continue when we reach out to them and try and contact them for, to ask for their assistance or advice on topics. Yep. But yeah, it's something that I don't think people use enough. The other thing I would say is on your point there about online sources. I know I don't know if books have gone out of fashion completely, but I have had some success on a number of projects where just almost by coincidence there's happened to have been a book published just about the time that I'm looking into that topic,
right?
Which has been a really useful resource.
Yeah.
So,
happy days.
Yeah, it's always worth having a quick scan of the publishers to see what's come out. You don't necessarily have to resort to some of the large online booksellers. You could go direct to specialist publishers. I think it's worth knowing about different specialist publishers that are out there. And that's potentially somewhere, if you can go and just quickly purchase a book or get one from a library or something like that to have a look at the information that's in there, it can give you a great start point. It may not be as sort of bang up to date to the day of what you're doing, but at least it gets you on top of the context for that topic.
And so the first step there is identifying your avenues of open source information on a topic, and then after you've done that, I guess it's then about building searches, is it? Would you say? And then is it about coming up with keywords and putting them together?
It's all about the keywords, definitely. Searching and getting on top of information is all about keywords, really. Fundamentally, and knowing how to manipulate them, knowing how search engines will help you with different operators, those kinds of things to help you get on top of different, or basically to help you drill down into the huge, vast sort of indexes of information that they've got to pick out the individual bits that you're interested in. That's where the search operators come in, is really just filtering down.
And I guess you've got to keep your initial research question in mind, right? Hopefully that's quite a specific question, but sometimes not always like that. But I guess that dictates the what your search terms are going to be, right?
Yeah, and on the climate change one, for that briefing I started off with the broad topic of what will be the impact of climate change for militaries in sort of 20 or 30 years. But then you sort of realise that actually it's such a vast topic. There's certain elements that you maybe can't cover in the space of a short briefing. So I had to leave aside one area that I was quite keen to look at, which was what are the new technologies that are coming out, especially in the defence sector, that are being adapted to climate change. So, we're starting to see more electric vehicles actually being developed, hybrid engines for planes, for example, things like that, which could also help militaries sort of adapt to climate change in the future. But yeah, that was sort of an area that I just didn't have the scope for. So I think part of doing that is building out the questions that you really want to address and making them as specific as possible. I'm guessing. Well, I'm saying I'm guessing, but I know obviously on the area that you work on in terms of drilling into social media, and that's an area that you probably spend more time on than I do these days. Again, you've got to be very specific in what or have a specific question in mind when you're looking into it. But then I guess you're also approaching it from the perspective of doing more general monitoring. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I guess as with all kind of avenues of open source information, it all depends on your topic, I guess, in a way, and the topic that you're focusing on, where those, in terms of social media, where those sources are based in terms of what social media platforms they tend to use. So whenever I'm beginning, research on social media, that's one of the first questions I asked is actually the community that I'm looking at. Which platforms are they on? Sounds like an obvious question.
Yeah.
But there's some companies out there like Hootsuite, for example, have done some great research on the most popular messaging apps in particular countries. It's always worth having a look at that before you start your research on social media, because you may think platform X is so popular in country Y. And that might be the case, but you may be missing a different platform in that country. That is it will be an important avenue for your research. So
switching to thinking more about social media specifically, what sort of, or if any, big changes have you seen recently? Has there been some things that you've noticed that have affected your searching? Because I know earlier in the year we saw some big shifts, but anything in the last month or so?
We did have a crackdown on extremists on Telegram, the messaging app Telegram.
Yeah.
So I think, from that point of view, the analysts in this area are really looking at where extremists, and specifically Islamist extremists, where they're going to be going to next. And this just really, I guess the wider point here, without getting into the weeds of specific platforms, is you always have to have that inbuilt platform intelligence in your team. When something like this happens online, more likely than not, your sources are going to shift to a different social media platform. Mm-hmm. The question then becomes, how well do you know that new platform? And can you operate effectively on it in terms of searching for information on it, and also in terms of trying to minimise your online shadow on that platform as well. That's the challenge, and that's an ongoing thing in the world of social media, as I'm sure you're aware. It's a very kind of fast-moving world. Different day, different platform.
Right,
it's the name of the game,
of course,
in this area.
Well, are there any new platforms or newer platforms that you've been focused on more recently?
Yeah, so one thing that we've been doing some research on in Jane's Intelligence Unit in recent weeks is decentralised social media platforms. An example of a centralised platform would be Facebook or Twitter, for example, platforms that are controlled by a single entity that sits on a specific set of servers. So the decentralised social media world is basically the opposite of that. So it's social media platforms that are controlled by multiple entities and based on multiple servers. So there's no single point of control in those platforms. Now,
and who provides those servers then? Because obviously Facebook, well, I assume at least, that all of their data is held on servers that they own.
Yes.
But with decentralised services, who owns that infrastructure?
That's a really great question. So within this world of decentralised social media platforms, so we've been looking at something called federated social media networks. So basically these are a series of interconnected social media platforms that have been created from different source code. So that source code is publicly available, and anyone can actually take that source code and then create their own social media platform. When you take that source code and you create your own platform, you're effectively creating your own instance, is what it's known as in the decentralized social media world. You create your own instance of that social media platform. Okay. So, for example, Mastodon is one of the most prominent examples of this source code. So there's been a bunch of developers that have developed that source code.
And that's online. An open source tool, isn't it?
It's an open source.
Anyone can contribute to in terms of development, or take the code and...
Anyone can take that code and essentially create their own instance of Mastodon. I mean, Mastodon itself has its own centralized platform called Mastodon Social, but then others have taken that Mastodon source code and then created their own instances of that, and those instances are connected. So they're connected with each other. You can communicate between those platforms, but they sit on different servers and they're administered by the individuals who've actually created those platforms.
Right.
So it's decentralized in that sense.
So decentralized, but still linked together.
Still linked together. Yes, a little bit of a halfway house, I guess, in some areas. There's all different types of communities in the social media world. I mean, in the decentralized social media world, it's a really good place for gathering information. And there's a couple of useful tools that I use to try and build my awareness of what this kind of world is. So one is the Federation website. You can get it at federation.info. Basically, that allows you to see what federated social media projects there are. So Mastodon, for example, is one project. Another project might be Diaspora. Another one is Palorama, for example. And these are just basically source codes that have been developed and then publicised online. So you can take whatever you want from those platforms and create your own instance of them. This actual website, federation.info, is pretty cool because you can basically see how many nodes or how many instances there are of Mastodon or of Diaspora or whatever.
Yeah.
And another really cool one is the Fediverse. So basically this one is called Fediverse.network, and that basically allows you to search for or to see the most popular instances on each project. So if I wanted to see, what's the most popular instance on Mastodon, for example, I could see it on that platform.
And those websites are publicising that because people will be interested in joining those most popular. I guess they're almost like little communities of their own, right?
Based on a range of interests.
Okay.
Yeah, based on a range of interests. Yeah. So it's a great way. If you've got a particular interest, you could put your search terms in one of these websites, and it would give you back instances that are covering these particular topics.
Got it. So from an OSINT perspective, you're looking at those and thinking, right, let's have a look and maybe dip into one of these communities to see what kind of activity there is there?
Exactly. I think one of the barriers in this area is if you identify a specific instance you then have to log into that instance. So it's not kind of completely open source from the ones that I've seen.
Yeah.
So again, it's kind of a barrier, but I mean, I guess you have to create your own.
I think certainly for people working in government, law enforcement, agencies, departments, etc., that's generally sometimes a line over which they've then, if they cross into anything where they've got to log in or use an account, then they've got to get some sort of approval, because they potentially run the risk that they're going from doing general research into online surveillance, and so they've got to get the right approvals in place. So yeah, that's certainly something that's for some organisations, some OSINT practitioners, that's sometimes the point at which their research stops. But yeah, for others, it may continue just with the right approvals in place.
Yeah, I mean, another point to add there is once you log into one of these, create an account in one of these instances, theoretically, you can then communicate with users on other instances, but that only goes part way, and it depends on the protocols of these source codes. So not all the source codes communicate with each other.
Interesting.
So you can, it's a little bit complicated, but you can see posts from another instance in some occasions if those protocols talk to each other.
But the content you're going to find on those social media instances is stuff that you're not going to find by searching Google.
Right.
It's stuff that you almost got to be in the know to figure out where it is and know whether there's anything useful or interesting there for your particular topic of research. Is that right? Yeah,
I would say, I mean, I would categorise it now as one of the more obscure parts of the internet, but it's certainly an area that we're watching and going forward we're going to be doing more research.
You see that sort of area growing?
Yeah, I think, and also as individuals, or there's been certain kind of concerns raised in the social media world about certain social media companies, gathering your data and controlling that data. I think this decentralized world is kind of a reaction to that. It's kind of, you can create your own platform out of that, which you control.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because there was a nice little chart put out by Charter Daily, which is an Instagram account that puts out charts on a huge variety of different topics each day. But they put out one a while back showing and it was just it was a very simplistic sort of set of data. It was just looking at Google Trends and comparing the terms how to delete Facebook versus how to delete Instagram. And there was a big spike for the how to delete Facebook searches globally around the time of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So I think since then, and I think as more of that has rumbled on, obviously that was a one-off spike, and that level of activity went sort of back to normal relatively quickly after. But I think as a general trend, certainly there seems to be more talk of people becoming disillusioned with platforms like Facebook. I think they're not helping themselves with things like this is purely my opinion, but they're not helping themselves with things like their policy on political ads. I think that's also putting people off, because it's just increasing the noise and the disinformation and things like that are occurring on the platform. And we've seen, I think, some media coverage recently of the WT social platform, which is a Wiki Tribune social media platform, which is run by the same people who run Wikipedia. I think it's still, in the initial sort of launching phase, testing phase, etc. But it's designed to be more privacy oriented. So I wonder if these areas are worth starting to get to know and become familiar with now, so that as they grow, you're able to access information if there is useful information on there. Yeah. Or quickly assess whether you find anything useful on there or not.
I think that's true. I mean, I guess in the decentralized social media world, you've got that concern. How long is this particular instance going to last? But the fact that there's so many instances out there means that that world is going to continue to exist and probably going to expand in the future. And as a reaction to the more centralized platforms, we may see, particularly if there's calls on particular platforms, people are kicked off particular platforms for different reasons. We may see, and indeed partly we've already seen in the extremist world, but we may see certain communities gravitate more.
So for OSINT practitioners or OSINT teams generally, does that mean then that if they want to be able to access information in those areas, they've got to apportion more kind of specialist resources, or have somebody who's got the specialist skills and knowledge to know how to access those areas, quickly have a look, see if there's stuff of interest, or monitor them, and
without a doubt,
to see when things might be popping up that could be of interest to them.
Definitely in terms of what you said, and also in terms of what access you have to sources there. I mean, I mentioned a few minutes ago about some of these protocols that don't speak to each other. So sometimes you may think you're logged into one instance and you've got access to all these other instances. That might not necessarily be the case. So I guess for an OSINT team, it's understanding which protocols talk to each other. How many instances do you really have access out there to? So yeah, again, it goes back to platform intelligence and having someone in the team who is, constantly aware of the updates to these platforms within and between these platforms.
Interesting. And platform intelligence specifically, I mean, that's something that I know you're working on regularly and keeping up to date on. And is that something that over the course of next year we can expect to see more of within the Jane's products?
Definitely. So one of the things we're looking to do is certainly develop a lot more analysis on how these individuals are using specific social media platforms. We already, of course, have militant propaganda analysis, which is one of our products, which really is a great product for understanding what militants are saying online. So what we really want to do is kind of complement that and take forward a kind of an area that looks at actually not just what they're saying online, but how they're doing it, and what platforms they're using to voice that on, how they're using those platforms, and where they might be going to next, which is, of course, the $1 million question.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, you mentioned the sort of activity by Telegram to close down some extremist accounts recently.
Yeah.
And I sort of saw that being mentioned, and I was wondering, is that the first time Telegram has done that, or is that something they've done in the past? Because I know other platforms recently have been quite active in that area. Twitter's been doing a lot of that, Facebook to some extent. YouTube, I know, is continually looking for that kind of content, obviously, and trying to get rid of it, and obviously struggling to keep up. But was that new for Telegram? Was that something they've done a few times before?
Yeah, my understanding is it's not new. They have tried it before, and actually, if you're on that platform, you will see specific channels dedicated to identifying accounts linked to the Islamic State. It's been a part of an ongoing effort, I think. I mean, one of my interests is looking at Islamist extremists in Southeast Asia. You talk about removing Islamic State accounts on Telegram, but from what I'm seeing, their supporters in Southeast Asia, Islamic State and Al Qaeda, are still on that platform. Right. So it's a part way of a removal, but and a lot of these things will depend on what your research area is. I mean, we're just talking about Islamist extremists on Telegram. If you look at the extreme right on Telegram, they are going ahead on that platform relatively unhindered. Right.
So a lot of that activity is continuing.
Yeah.
Do you find with the groups that you're looking at, or the kind of activity you're researching, do they tend to jump onto new platforms that become popular? So, and you're going to have to forgive me here because this is not a platform I've used, but it's one we're hearing a lot about in the news recently, which is TikTok.
Yeah.
Is that one attracting the kind of interest of people that you might be researching, or the groups and activities that you're researching in trying to find, extremist content?
Yeah, me personally, I've not seen any examples of that. That's not to say that they're not on there. They totally do experiment with new platforms. I mean, one is a social platform called MeWe. Another one was BlabPad.
Okay.
Kind of like similar to Facebook, these platforms, but they're totally branching out and having a little bit of a dabble in these different areas. I find the one they always come back to though is Telegram. That's where their core support seems to be.
Interesting. Yeah, because I was interested by the recent story on TikTok of the vlogger who was posting videos of sort of makeup tutorials, etc., and then sort of did one about the Chinese persecution of Muslims in the west of China, the Uyghurs. And it's fascinating to see how people are skirting around some of the censorship that is applied by some of these platforms, and also how those platforms are then running into problems because they may have pressure to censor certain types of information in certain countries, but in others that attracts that type of criticism that means they have to retract those sorts of things. And
that's a really interesting case.
It's a really dynamic space in part because of that, I suppose, isn't it?
I mean, that specific case is a great example of a user exhibiting good platform intelligence, essentially.
Yeah, true.
And actually testing that platform.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so it's not just from the perspective of individuals who are monitoring these platforms. I mean, users are actually getting better at understanding and using these platforms themselves.
Yeah, no, indeed. Well, this is fascinating. I mean, I'm sure we could talk about this all day, but it's been a really interesting year, I think, for us. I mean, for you, what would you say have been the biggest sort of changes that you've seen in 2019 for open source intelligence? And have you got any thoughts around where things might go next year, or what we might expect to see? Any things you're planning for next year?
I think one of the biggest changes, the biggest things to note this year was the lack of ability to conduct search queries on Facebook. That was
losing some of those tools that we had before.
Losing some of those tools, yeah, exactly.
The Intel techniques and the others,
losing some of that. And from my perspective, from individuals, other OSINT practitioners who I speak to, it's been a real headache. I mean, there's been ways around that other OSINT specialists have come up with and published online, some really useful guidance. But in the case of Facebook, it can be quite difficult to get your head around some of those new ways of searching. So I think that's both the biggest thing from this year for me, and what I will try to be focusing on next year as well, is to try and get my head around some more of those specific search strings in order to be more effective at searching on social media.
Interesting.
I guess the key thing is in all of this, and we've spoke about before, haven't we, in previous podcasts, is to just know your sources, because tools will come and go, but as long as you've got that subject matter knowledge, as well as your established process of OSINT, which I think is something that we highlight on our OSINT courses, you can then fall back on that process. And when tools go, you can kind of identify where the gaps are, and then more easily identify what you need to do to address those gaps. As long as you've got a process there, I think that's the most important thing.
No, I think for me, the biggest sort of things I think we take away from 2019 are the things that you've talked about there, but also the increasing quantity of misinformation that's out there. And hopefully, I think we're starting to see more and more initiatives now to try and get us beyond information which is potentially weaponized or trying to influence us in some way. We've seen, for example, I think it was just today, it was announced Google were going to stop political advertising ahead of Singapore's elections. So things like that, I think, are going to help in time. But at the moment, I think we've just seen this huge increase in disinformation that's going on online. And I'm hoping that we're going to find more ways to try and combat that, or find better ways of verifying information, especially as more and more information output gets automated. That's a big challenge for normal open source intelligence researchers and practitioners. So that, I think, that really broadly reflects, I think, from the kind of queries that we've had this year, especially in training. More and more people are asking, how do we verify our information? What do we need to do to make sure it's reliable? This is an overriding concern. It's always been there in the past, but it's much bigger than it has been. And so I think that's going to continue into next year. I don't think there's any shortcut to it. I don't think there's any, no one's come up yet with a silver bullet to help us figure out how to identify all the reliable information. But, hopefully we'll sort of get better at spotting the bad information or the fake information, the fake news, the disinformation that's out there. And that's an area I think that we're going to all be working on next year.
I think that's going to be a challenge for the coming years, actually, as people get more adept at the creation of fake news as well, or disinformation, because just as much as individuals are skilling themselves up to better understand this area, individuals that are producing this stuff are also skilling themselves. It's a bit of
it's a cat and mouse game. Yeah. Well, on that note, thanks, Mark, for your time today.
Sure.
It's been another interesting conversation for us on our podcast, and look forward to doing more of these next year. For anyone listening, thanks for your time listening to us. Thanks to Josh for producing these. And what I'd like to put out to all our audience for this podcast as well is to get in touch with us and send us any questions that you have, any things you'd like us to cover in 2020. And if there's any topics you're interested in, do let us know, and we will do our best to cover those. Thanks for listening, and we'll hopefully speak to you on the next podcast. And for more information on how we can help with OSINT training and development, go to janes.com/OSINT training.